some of you know a little bit of my story. I want to say our story, not just shared by my wife and my children and myself, but by a number of people who were part of this. Having served churches in the state of Texas for almost 20 years, the Lord led us to Maryland into another established church. But I'd been transformed because I'd had a sort of renewing experience of what my purpose in life was, which really is the story behind the story of why we're doing this in the framework in which we are. The Lord blessed our 3 years of ministry at the First Baptist Church of Brooklyn beyond any expectation. We saw people pouring in there from nine different zip codes. I mentioned that before. This was before social media. We did no advertising. Everything was strictly word of mouth. It was the original social media. It was from mouth to mouth and hand to hand. And after 3 years of experiencing that, I felt impressed it was time to go out and start from scratch and plant a church. And out of those 9 zip codes that people came from, most of them came from one. And so I knew that was where we wanted to plant this church. It happened to be in Glen Burnie, Maryland. Ended up going to a laundromat there for a couple of years. It was an open door that the Lord provided for us, and He blessed us. We had to multiply services early on, and we outgrew the space. So after 2 years, in 1995, we needed another place to meet, and they were hard to come by. We were already larger than most all of the churches in the area. And so a church building would not serve our purposes, and I was directed to go and talk to the management of the local mall. And the local mall in that town happened to be a historic structure. Matter of fact, it's in the historic registry, the Herondale Mall. It opened in 1958. John F. Kennedy, who was a junior senator from Massachusetts, was at the ribbon cutting event because there were 2 things that stood out about it. It was the first fully enclosed mall on the East Coast and east of the Mississippi in the whole country. And it happened to be the first enclosed mall that was fully climate controlled, which means heated in the winter and air conditioned in the summer. And it was a huge draw south of the metropolitan area in Baltimore, and people drove for miles to attend this place. Set on a tract of land that was 33 acres. There's a large stone still sitting there that was carved on 4 sides that sort of told the story of the mall. And it had a great run. It had a great day. I was reading in my reviewing about the mall that it actually had 2 large gathering areas inside that had the stores around it. At one time it had a restaurant there. And in one of those large spaces there was an aviary. And the story goes that they had mynah birds in there, and some of the local youth taught those mynah birds to speak, swearing. Now, you know, it's not corroborated that that's happened, but I'm not surprised. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure we had people in our church who were those youth that back in the day, they taught those birds how to cuss. Well, needless to say, the aviary was removed and the birds were taken out. And after a number of years, the mall began to fall in decline because other malls were being built in the area, bigger, more lavish, bigger anchor stores. And so it fell into decline, and the Rouse Corporation that I had to negotiate with in order to gain access to use some of that space, they just sort of let it go, and eventually they were going to sell it. So we were in the last couple of years of the viability with a few stores left there. And so negotiated that contract about 5,000 square feet, but it was in an obscure location in the mall. If you go back and look at images like this one, or you go back and read about the mall, you'll read about all the spaces in that place except the one that we occupied. The only way to access it from inside the mall was there was a glass door in a corner between stores that had no markings on it, and all you could see was a set of stairs that went upstairs. And you went upstairs and it was one large room, about 5,000 square feet of space, that had been surrounded by, I'm guessing it was offices. A number of doors surrounded this space, and nothing was marked. Our primary entrance, because the mall was closed on Sundays, was an outside door that was a service entrance. It was a innocuous-looking gray steel door that had no markings on it. We were blessed to have a service elevator associated with this to move equipment in and out. And I know that legally you're not supposed to use it to move passengers, and I'm not going to remember whether we did or not. I was glad we had it for the purpose that we were able to use it. And so you had this one large room, and we thought, well, this is ideal. It's a place to gather for worship. We can turn these multiple rooms around the perimeter into classrooms, but we had to construct a wall. I bought temporary freestanding panels from the state of Maryland surplus store that we were able to create a sort of a walkway down one side, so when people came in, they could make their way around to the classrooms or the bathrooms without interrupting the service itself. And so it was not an easy place to find. You had to know where we were in order to find us. The same thing had been true in the laundromat, although it was such a much smaller building. There was a front door and a back door, both of them unmarked steel doors that were gray. And so it's either you went in the laundromat or you found the stairs that came up where we were. Well, anyway, we were blessed to have the opportunity. And so the outside door, we couldn't put signage out there, but I had I designed a logo, and that we had a vinyl thing print. And so we put the logo of our church on that steel door outside. And so driving around that mall, that 33 acres, that's how you found us. We were part of a state convention, the state of Maryland's Baptist Convention of Maryland, Delaware. And the state executive director, who was a friend of ours, very much a supporter and believing in what we were trying to do, he tried to find us. He wanted to come and check out and see how we were doing. It took him 2 weeks to find us. He kept driving around until he finally found the door to come in. Now, you know, there's just too much interesting history about this. We were glad to have been there because of the people that we were blessed to reach, you know, because our objective was to reach a pagan pool. Folks that would not be found in anybody else's church because they'd either been turned off by church or they'd never been in church. And their lives and their lifestyle were so conspicuously on the other side of things that they felt like they were an object of contempt anytime they would go into a traditional church. So we were grateful. I mean, if you want to call them hellraisers, that's who we reached. And I was grateful for that. I'd done trying to reach the nice people, and this is who we actually reached. And I know that many of them were surprised when they found us there because they spent their youth finding wayward ways at that mall. It's where some of them first learned to cop drugs and to use them, and so to come back there and to find life in Christ. Now, all that sort of background and it's sort of framing what I'm compelled to share with today, because I'm sort of taking a detour. You know, our ministry is Church Rebirth Ministries, and I've just returned from attending in South Carolina the state convention here for the Southern Baptist churches, and the mantra, the drumbeat these days is revitalization. You know, coming alongside of the struggling, dead and dying churches and trying to help them find a sort of a revitalization or a new life. And you know, we've been doing this for almost 15 years now. First in Maryland and now here. And so sitting there listening to the drumbeat and watching most of these good church people come in there and be a part of that, and realizing that many of them still don't understand how it works. They grew up in church. They had good and godly parents. They grew up in Sunday school and vacation Bible school, and they became adults, and that was their whole life and their whole culture. And for them, the notion of building relationships, meaningful relationships with people outside of the gospel, and somehow building bridges to them to invite them to Christ is still a challenge, because they're thinking from the standpoint of a church person. And so I was a little bit frustrated there, because, you know, we're trying to do this. We have this ministry that that some of you are providing financial support for, that we've been able to travel and meet with people, shoot videos, to do interviews to that very end. And we've had a little bit of opportunity with some churches, and we're still in some conversation with others. And then they'll drive back. I've learned that somebody said, I think, 100 years ago, the shortest way between two cities was a good conversation. That was back when they rode trains or some sort of public transportation, and they were spot on, because I realized if I've got a drive of 20 minutes or longer, and the worse the traffic is for my commute, then if I can call somebody and have a constructive conversation with them, man, it's like the traffic doesn't exist. It doesn't matter whether it's stop or go. It doesn't matter what's going on, because my mind is somewhere else engaged in conversation with them. And so it's a 2-hour drive from Columbia, South Carolina to Somerville. And so, I call and have these conversations. And it was in one of those conversations that I was brought to sort of frustration and thinking about the events of the convention and the meetings I sat in and the conversations I had with people there, and coming back here and waiting and looking and hoping to be able to engage others in some meaningful way to help them get there, realizing that God did something in me in 1992 and 3 that sort of shifted my focus and my understanding. And that's been a never-ending process. As I've interviewed churches, interviewed pastors, I've had to refine my understanding of how people think and how churches think, and what the real obstacles are to overcome, to their being willing to have a conversation to say, Dorothy, we're not in Kansas anymore, and you need to come to terms with that. And so what do you do if you're not in Kansas anymore? If you've got flying monkeys and wicked witches and there's an Oz behind the curtain somewhere, it's just not, it's not normal. And so how do you adapt to this environment? And a part of the challenge is understanding how people that are not like you, that didn't grow up in the Cleaver household, they weren't a part of the Walton family, that life for them by and large has been dysfunctional, and so their minds have been processing life in a decidedly different way. And before you can have a church that's going to turn the corner, there needs to be an understanding of how those people who need a turned corner actually think. And that was where I was brought to thinking about them all. So let me read this text. It's simply a brief portion of the larger text, and I'm not sure where all this is going to go, but it's something I felt like I needed to share. In Romans chapter 7, it's a great passage about the struggle that everyone has between what they want to do and what they need to do and what they end up doing. And this is Paul. I'm going to pick up in verse 21 and read through the last few verses of this chapter, because this is where he ends up after talking about his own personal struggle. And he says, I find then the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. For I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man, but I see a different law in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind, and making me a prisoner of the law of sin which is in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will set me free from the body of this death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then on the one hand, I myself with my mind am serving the law of God, but on the other with my flesh the law of sin. If you go back and examine this larger passage, you realize that Paul identifies more than one law that's influencing his life, his choices, his actions, his decisions, his reactions. But we come down to talk about just two principal ones. And I think it's important to go back and identify those things, because I think you will recognize those are influences in your life. But he talks about here in this section of the chapter about the law of the body and the law of the mind. And I realize in thinking about the challenge that I have, the challenge that believers have, the challenge that the church in 2022 has, and going forward, it's never going to go backwards. We just need to own to the fact that the future is not going to be anything like the past. The ship is not going to turn around. We're going to set in this direction. It's not going to necessarily get better. It's going to get worse. And the question is, how long are some of us going to live to see how bad it actually can be? But in the meantime, our challenge is, how do you engage a culture and a mind that didn't grow up processing life and being influenced and shaped like mine was? Wasn't born into a functioning Christian home, but it wasn't long after my birth that my dad renewed his faith journey, was called to preach. My mom made a commitment of faith to Jesus Christ, and so that was the life that my brothers and I knew. Fast forward, graduate from high school, go to college, get a bachelor's degree, go to seminary, get a master's degree. I tried to pursue a doctorate, but ministry just got in the way, and I couldn't do both of those, and so I dropped that. And here now, almost 50 years later, I started preaching in 1974. And so here, almost 50 years later, life is not the same. The truth of Scripture hasn't changed at all. The value of that has not changed at all, but how to build bridges between the truth of Scripture and people that have no reason to even believe it poses a unique challenge, because we've left behind the culture that assumed everyone somehow was going to be engaged in a religious environment of some form or fashion. That's dead and gone, and we're not going back there. And so my challenge is always, how do I understand how people think, so that when I'm attempting to engage somebody or trying to help a church, realizing that the engagements are different, how is it that people process life, and how do we frame it in such a way that we're recognizing all these laws that Paul is talking about? There's a law of the mind, and there's the law of sin, and the law of flesh, and all these laws. And I thought about Herondale Mall. Because, number one is that in the space that we occupied for a couple of years and outgrew it, we went from about 150 people to over 500 people in 2 years. We just, skipped the challenges that most churches face in that stretch of their journey. And realizing that the people that were being drawn, these weren't, God-loving, God-fearing church people. These were people that were out there just sort of managing life, and at some point life wasn't satisfying enough, and they knew somebody that knew us, and they were invited to come, and because the environment was compelling enough, or the experience was compelling enough because it wasn't what they expected. You didn't have to get dressed up to come. We had a giant coffee pot, and until we had 500 people, we'd take a little coffee break in the middle and people to have coffee, but we got to where we couldn't serve that many people. And they saw their friends there. They saw all the people just like them that didn't look like church people. And I garnered a reputation of being like them because I didn't use big theological sounding words, although I know all of those words. But it achieved nothing in that environment, that context. Because if people didn't understand the gospel that was being communicated in a way and in a language that they could value and appreciate, they were never going to make the trip to come across. And so the experience was so compelling to them, they came back and came back and came back until finally, we got to have a one-on-one conversation with them, and they made a commitment to Christ. So I thought about them all. So, we had this giant room with all these doors in it that, well, it happened. The battery on the camera died, and when I went back to edit it, I realized that I'd lost a part of my monologue or my speech or my lecture or my lesson, whatever you want to call it. So this is my attempt to reinvent that as we resume the rest of the video. So when I was thinking about that big room at the mall that had all the doors around it, and thinking about how people think in order to build bridges to them, I came to the conclusion that folks look at life in two decidedly different ways. That it's like there's a long wall running to the left and a long wall running to the right that's got multiple doors. And the doors aren't necessarily labeled, but the walls are. And depending on your sort of temperament and your makeup as to which side of this wall you try those doors, because those different directions are decided in different ways in which people process life and think about things. And so it's from that perspective that we resume our conversation and talking about how people think and the doors that I was reminded of in my mall experience. Those would be the doors of intellectualism or slash philosophy or philosophical. There's a segment of humanity that wants to believe that the mind can resolve all the issues. And there is a logical, rational explanation for everything that is true and is real. And if you can't qualify everything intellectually or rationally, then it doesn't really exist, or it's not true. And for those people who are trying to find truth at the intellectual level, they're bound by their own ability to reason at every level. I want to think it's akin to, if you know anything about Albert Einstein and his theory of relativity, that we may know nothing about physics, but we do know E equals mc squared. That explains 99.9% of all physical laws. But we've since discovered that it doesn't explain quantum mechanics at the subatomic level. And now astronomers are discovering that when they look at the universe, that it may not apply out there as well. And his frustration was that how do I find a theory that explains all of that too? That he was frustrated with that. So you have people over here who are trying to find truth at that level, and they tend to reject the supernatural because you can't qualify in the lab. And so therefore, if you can't qualify, and they're real big on developing theories that they can't qualify either in an attempt to explain the natural universe in the absence of a supernatural God. And so they're trying to find truth going through one of those doors. And the doors are as numerous as the philosophical positions or intellectual positions that people take. And they tend to look at folks that don't think like them or don't process life like them in a very condescending way, as being much simpler people. It would be the Lenin or one of the part of the Communist Manifesto that says religion is the opiate of the people, because there was no basis for it. So that's one wall with all the doors going down here. And there are a lot of people that are knocking on those doors and going through those doors looking for truth, and they keep coming out and they keep trying a new door, and they come out and they keep trying a different door. They're sort of like my state executive director trying to find the door to get into the mall where we were. Now, who's on the, what are the doors going down the other side of that wall? That would be the walls of the doors of existentialism. And existentialism is simply the laws of experience. And this is where I'm convinced that probably 90% of humanity lives on this side. Most people aren't intellectual, philosophical by nature. That's reserved for a select few and a very small minority. Because for them, life is experienced as a part of understanding. And so I would put in there for them, while the intellectuals are philosophical, I would say the existentialists are emotional, because for them, life and truth and reality is defined by how they feel about it, for right or wrong. And we know that feelings are among the most fickle attributes that people have, because they can betray you. You can find something humorous that really shouldn't be funny at all, but you laugh about it. You can be moved to tears by things that aren't even true. You can watch a sad movie, an animation, and be moved emotionally. And so, how does all that work? But I know that most people live on that side of the wall, going through those various doors, because number one, feeling it's a natural attribute that we have. And number two is it really dictates for most people whether life is enjoyable or not, whether life is worth living or not, whether they feel good or they feel bad, whether they're happy or they're sad. It's what drives the use of chemistry to find that. When people are miserable with life, then they'll introduce a substance in their system to stimulate that part of their brain that will alter their perception of reality. And so they're driven back to that, because as soon as the high goes away, the experience goes away, they're back down in reality, and usually they're further behind where they were before, and they keep going back. And whether it's a weekend experience or it's a daily experience, that's all it's about. It's that existential component of that. And so when there's a search for truth, then for many people, truth is going to be predicated on how it makes somebody feel. And which is the reason that in our day, some of the most popular religious movements are feel-good movements. They're movements where people are told what they want to hear because it makes them feel good. Whether it's the prosperity gospel that paints a picture of a God that wants everybody to be happy and rich and famous and healthy and yada yada in ad nauseum, people are going to be drawn to that because it's what they hope and believe is true. It's that sort of existential experience, and yet, it at some point, even it runs sort of shallow. Because then when you start thinking about, when you start using the mind that you have to understand reality, and you realize that sometimes how you feel can be a betrayal of what is real, then you're left to step back and go, well, I thought I could trust my feelings, but man, my feelings have betrayed me too. They're so fickle. They're so subject to all kinds of influences. And so they step back. That's the reason, just like the others on the other wall, they keep going from door to door to door to door to door, looking for truth. Where is truth to be found? And in my trying to understand this, and I don't consider myself a premier intellectual, I think I have a reasonably functioning mind. I'm perfectly capable, although less driven by existentialism and emotion than most people are. I'm very guarded because of my life experience. I want to go in every context whether people are having, are engaging emotionally in that, and I want to observe that intellectually to try to understand the cause and effect. It's simply how my brain works. And so in the context of kingdom stuff, in the context of reading the Bible, in the context of preaching, in the context of trying to help churches, I was driven to this passage where Paul recognizes that there's this spectrum. And for him, the spectrum there were multiple laws, and by law, I think he means an evident influence, a source of influence in what we do and how we feel and what we think, and ultimately in what is true, and whether we can experience some form of freedom in our lives because we recognize the source of all laws. And so I would put in the center between the doors on this side and the doors on this side, the doors of philosophy and intellectualism, and the doors of emotion and existentialism, I'd put a set of French doors. All the other doors are single doors, but I would put a set of French doors, and on one panel I would put existential, and in the other panel I would put philosophical. Because I'm convinced that the people who arrive at the truth of the gospel, the people that churches are effectively able to engage in presenting the gospel to them if they have no prior orientation of the gospel. It doesn't matter if they grew up in the Bible Belt America, whether they grew up in a less godly part of the Northwest or the Northeast, whether they grew up in a third world country dancing around a pot of soup with a bone in their nose and a grass skirt on, whether they grew up in a country that they'd been taught to worship their ancestors or Buddha or the million gods of the Hindus. It doesn't matter, that all those people are looking for the right door somewhere. And I think the challenge for us as Christ followers and the challenge for the church is how do you present a door that's a set of doors that represents both sides of our humanity, so that the person who's looking for the informed, the intellectual, the reasoned responses, they can look at that and go, okay, here's another door that's got my label, and I'm going to go through that door. And the people on the other side that's looking for something that makes them feel something, is not all about the mind, but it's about the heart and the emotions, is they can see the door and say, well, maybe this is the door, not realizing when those doors open up, they both walk into the same place. Because in this passage we looked at, Paul realizes that the place that he stands and the question that he asks, because he struggles. Here's the guy who was the religious man's religious man, a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Pharisee. He was a nitpicking, T-crossing, I-dotting legalist. That's how he'd been raised. That's how he processed life. And he rejected the notion that Jesus could be the fulfillment of everything that he had ever been taught. Because intellectually, rationally, Jesus didn't check the boxes. See, that was his form of intellectualism, was the Messiah checks all of my boxes. And he was so offended by anybody who proposed that Jesus checked all the right boxes that he consented to the death of the first martyr, Stephen. And he took his life ambition is to eliminate all those other people that were like Stephen. And it was then that he had an experience that nothing had prepared him for. There was nothing in Judaism akin to an encounter with Jesus Christ. It was all about checking the boxes. Did I keep the law? Did I memorize the Torah? Did I do the sacrifices? Did I honor Moses? Did I? All those, were his rationalistic approach without trying to rationalize God, because for him, he couldn't imagine, he was a presuppositionist. He presupposed that God did exist. But then he had this encounter with Jesus that altered all of that. It turned his reality upside down. So he entered through one door thinking, here's the answer. And what he discovered was the whole other half this, God was there too in Jesus Christ. And as he began that journey, began as a missionary, preaching the gospel, planting churches all over the Roman Empire, discipling people, paying a dear price personally, beaten, shipwrecked, stoned, left for dead, abandoned by friends, left to rot in jail, eventually to lose his head for the cause of Christ under the reign of Nero. That he comes and confesses in his writing to the Romans this whole challenge that everyone has. And it's that challenge between these two aspects of our lives. Our experience and what we think is true based on how we feel, and our minds who say everything should be able to be resolved and concluded intellectually and rationally. And he comes to say, we have this conundrum. The conundrum is that you have all these laws that I'm struggling against. Some of them are laws of my mind, and some of them are the laws of my flesh. And he said, so when I think I've won this one, I turn around, I'm being bitten by this one. And when I turn to address this one, I'm being bitten by this one. He said, it's like being surrounded by a pack of dogs. I might be able to handle one or two, but, when the number exceeds that, it's like, many of you know I do hog hunting in South Carolina. And much of the time we're hunting with dogs. And when people say, how's that work? I said, it's really easy. The dogs catch the hogs. And it doesn't matter how big that hog is. The one that I killed last year was 484 pounds. Is you get 5 dogs latched onto that pig on its ears and nose and anywhere else they can bite on, they immobilize that thing. That hog can't move until we're there to, send it into hog heaven and in my freezer. But the same thing is true in trying to find this, everything can't be explained on one side of the door or the other. That when you go through one of those doors, you're entering into that other one and saying, there is reasoned explanation about things within the capacity of human reason to deal with that. But there are some things in life and some things in reality that our minds are simply not capable of dealing with. And while our response is very existential, when somebody asked me, when an intellectual asked me about my own faith journey, how do I deal with all the textual criticisms of stuff? The fact that we have doubts about how the Bible came together. Did Matthew write Matthew? Well, Matthew didn't write. He didn't speak or write Greek, so therefore he couldn't be the author of Matthew. And who was the primary source? Was Mark the first one? Was Matthew the first one? And how do you resolve the synoptic problem? Because you have seemingly different accounts of the same events in the Gospels, and how do you reconcile that? And they go through this whole exercise, this mental exercise, and saying, you can't explain it all, and because you can't explain it all, then none of it's true. And for me, the explanation is as simple as this. As a 6-year-old child, I didn't know anything about textual criticism. I didn't know anything about theories of inspiration. I didn't, I couldn't cite all 66 books in the New Testament. I hadn't read the Bible. I'm a child, and I'm sitting in a church service. Happens to be a Baptist church. My dad happens to be the preacher. I don't remember what he preached on that day, but sitting by myself in that room, nobody behind me, nobody beside me, nobody in front of me, and at the time the invitation of commitment came, I'm persuaded that I heard the voice of God. And in trying to remember exactly what was said, I'm convinced that all I heard was James. And that moves me even now. It's been 62 years ago. And I'm sitting there, and I do one of these numbers. I could have swore there was somebody around me who spoke my name. And what my spirit did, because there was no rational explanation for that. And it wasn't an emotional, that I interpreted as God's invitation to a relationship with Him. He spoke my name. I went forward and said yes to Jesus. And in all the reading that I've done, which has been extensive, in all the theological education that I've received, in all the criticisms that I've read by the intellectuals on this side, in all the accounts that I've read about people who became believers and then deconverted, you know, for them it's a revolving door. They can't get out of that door. They can't go forward and say, this is resolved, this is settled. I understand what I understand. I can explain what I explain, and what I don't. I have to trust God with. I can't base truth upon how I feel, because, you know, on a Monday morning at 3 o'clock in the morning when I can't sleep, I'm not feeling much good of anything, but that doesn't dictate what is true for me. So I guess I'm saying all this to say that we can't get lost in any one of these other doors, but I think we have to be familiar with them. We have to familiarize ourselves with who's going through this door and who's going through this door and why, and how do I take all that I believe is true based on the revelation of Scripture and the truth about Jesus Christ and the fact that there is a God that was before all things and will, you know, and sustains all things, that I can't explain Him. He's bigger than to go on a slide in a laboratory. I can't prove Him nor disprove Him. I can't prove to anybody else that I had a conversion experience, but that's not my calling to prove anything. My calling is simply make Christ known. And to know that when people have those encounters, explanations will no longer satisfy, because they will know. For them it'll be existential, but it'll also be intellectual, because there's nothing rationally that can explain what's happened to them, who changes their desires and their hearts and does something with them that no therapist could ever do. And so I'm convinced that the answer for churches that are dead and dying is they need to step back and evaluate whether they are more concerned about the condition of people that don't know Christ enough to invest in understanding how they think and process, so that when we gather as a believing community, that what we do isn't just for our own pleasure and own satisfaction. You know, I'm reasonably convinced that most traditional churches are there for existential reasons, because they like what's familiar. They like how it makes them feel. They like those old songs that are familiar. They like because of how it makes them feel. I mean, they can get gooey-eyed over some child who can't carry a tune in a bucket because they're so sweet and so sincere. And that's fine for them. They can love them with all their heart and soul and mind. But you bring in somebody that has an ear for music, that doesn't know God, and they doesn't know your sentimentality, and they doesn't know what, and they hear that and they're going, my soul, are these people deaf? If that came on the radio, I'd change radios. So Paul's answer to this is to recognize those laws that exist. They're not going to go away. The law of sin, it's not going to go away. It is deceptive and devious and conniving, and man, it'll suck you in a heartbeat. And then there's the law of the mind, which can do the same thing. It can play tricks with you unless you're willing to submit it to the mind of Christ. Funny thing, I think that's what Paul actually describes. To have what? The mind of Christ. And then to ultimately ask the question, wretched man that I am, who will set me free from the body of this death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. On the one hand, I myself, in my mind, am serving the law of God, but on the other, with my flesh, the law of sin. Those laws aren't going to go away. Those influences aren't going to diminish. The question is, am I going to see that the answer lies in a set of French doors? That when I open up, I find there that which I cannot explain and I cannot prove. That there's a God-shaped void in my heart and in my life. And despite my mind's incapacity to understand how it works, I find in there a peace that passes understanding, simply by saying yes to that which I cannot prove, in believing a God that I cannot see, because He provides me with a hope and a purpose in living and in life. And that purpose and that hope is magnified. It's magnified. When in faith, I don't try to be the answer man to everybody's questions about spirituality and Jesus and the Spirit and God, but I simply share the simplicity of the truth of the gospel and then get to watch somebody else go through the same kind of thing. So that somewhere along the way, with Paul, I can sit in a prison cell next to an Onesimus, a runaway slave. And I can find a kindred spirit with them because we both have had an encounter with Jesus. It is my hope that churches that see this, or believers that see this, will examine who they are and why they do what they do, and what is their relationship of understanding this spectrum of humanity that runs down these walls in both ways, with people looking. They're going to keep going to another door and another. They never stop and stay at one door. Trust me, they never. They keep looking because they're looking for something better and better and better and better and better. And they're only going to find it in the center when Jesus is through those doors. Thank you for indulging me this moment. This is the week before Thanksgiving. I had no particular plans about what I was going to do, but just the events of the past week and my processing, trying to find meaning in my place and my opportunity to encourage churches and people that either don't know Jesus and people that do know Jesus. This is who I am, and this is where I am. I appreciate your sharing this with others as we expand the tent flaps and have other people look forward to doing some more interviews. I had lunch while I was gone with a retired brigadier general who is teaching at the local college, and astounding story with him, and I'm going to get to do an interview with him and perhaps his wife as well as a part of this. So I'm blessed to do that. For those of you that prayerfully support us, thank you. For those of you that support through your giving, thank you very much. I'd like to hear from you. I'd like to know your questions, your observations, so you can contact me at this email address. I'll look forward to responding to you, or if you want to know how to give electronically, do that, and I will help you walk through that process. And if you'd just like to, as some do, old school, simply drop a check in the mail, you can do so. Mail it to Church Rebirth Ministries. We're a 501c3 organization. And mail it to this address, and it will go into the purposes of ministry for which I will truly be grateful. Pray for me as I discern the road ahead in doing what God has called me to do. See you next week.